Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Welcome to Budapest. The Hungarian capital looks as splendid as ever here on the banks of the Danube. The tourists have arrived en masse. But behind the alluring facade, there is trouble. Now, the European Parliament today accused Hungary's ruling Fidesz party of systematically undermining the rule of law, democracy and minority rights at home. The Hungarian foreign minister shot back, "All lies, mind your own business." Hungary, once a poster child of East European democracy, is at the heart of what President Emmanuel Macron has described as a civil war for the soul of Europe. This is a story about the power of fear and the usefulness of imaginary enemies. In case you hadn't noticed, Europe is in the heat of a battle about the future of democracy, and Hungary is now the front line. On Heroes Square in Budapest, the statues of the ancient Magyar tribal chiefs celebrate Hungary's stand against outside enemies, from Ottoman Turks to Soviet communists. Enter the latest tribal chief. The chin belongs to Viktor Orban, recently re-elected prime minister for a third time. The face is so familiar to Hungarians, they no longer need to see it. This was a famous speech about the dangers of Muslim migration, and the voice is played backwards because the artist behind this installation believes that that's where the country is heading. And here he is the right way round, on election night a few weeks ago, celebrating a so-called supermajority of 2/3 of parliamentary seats that allows him to rule unopposed. But how did he win it? With the message in this campaign ad played ad nauseam, the dual threats of Muslim migration and, yes, George Soros, the Jewish Hungarian-born financier and philanthropist. More on him in a minute. But first, the threat of Muslims.
If you have, let's say here, in this park, 30 Muslims praying, I don't want it. I don't want minarets here, mosques, and the muezzin, crying and using loudspeakers and inviting people to pray at 3:40 in the morning. No, I don't want it.
István Lovas is a household name here, and his is not a minority opinion. Remember this? 3 years ago, at the height of the migrant crisis, when Budapest's Keleti station was turned into a refugee camp for a few weeks, 500,000 migrants and refugees came here, most of them heading through on their way to Germany. So where are they now? We went in search of migrants at the border and found a fence. In fact, 4 fences, 2 of them electrified. Warning signs in Arabic, just in case. Guard towers, and the sound of emptiness. The reason people stopped coming is, of course, that the Turks did a deal with the EU 2 years ago, shutting down the so-called Balkan route to Western Europe. It really is a very impressive-looking fence, hints of the Berlin Wall, but its purpose has changed ever since the migrants and refugees stopped coming en masse. The new purpose of this thing is psychological. It's a political prop, a monument to Fortress Hungary. Near the border is the town of Hódmezővásárhely, picturesque, sleepy, docile, with one single officially registered migrant, and yet the population lives in fear. If you don't see any migrants, why are you afraid of them? I saw them on television, she told us, and I don't want them here.
Yeah.
But is she afraid of migrants in this town? Yeah. We went to see the mayor here. Péter Márki-Zay is a rare opposition voice, and he knows why his constituents voted for Fidesz and Orban in the recent election.
These people are not well informed. They do not see the corruption. They do not see, what is really going on. Of course, they don't necessarily care about judicial systems, let's say. But now, after 2 years, they fear migrants most. So they don't care about corruption. They don't care that they are living below the poverty limit, let's say. They fear of migrants and they vote for Fidesz.
The mayor took part in this recent anti-Orban demonstration in Budapest. They believe that democracy in Hungary is already in peril. The Fidesz party has captured 2/3 of the seats with less than half the votes, thanks to a change in the electoral law. It has shut down opposition newspapers, and with its supermajority, it can rewrite the constitution at will.
I mean, an eternal majority in a virtual one-party state with a muzzled press in modern Europe, in the European Union in 2018.
I'm a big European fan, if you want, EU fan. So I really would like to see a much stronger Europe, including protection from dictators, protection from corruption.
Afrikából és a Közel-Keletről.
Now remember that ad and the other imaginary villain.
Stop Soros. Készült Magyarország kormánya megbíz.
On TV and on countless walls during the election campaign. The billionaire was born in Hungary, and his Open Society Foundation has been promoting democracy here since 1984. In fact, it was his scholarship money that allowed Prime Minister Orban to study in Oxford as a young man. But now Soros is public enemy #1, and his foundation is considering closing down. Soros is an easy person for them to vilify and for many Hungarians to hate. Why is that?
Because he's rich, partly and maybe because he's Jew, and he's liberal. Enemy making is a tradition in Hungary, basically, enemy creation. So he was an ideal for enemy creation.
George Soros,
Yeah.
good guy or bad guy?
I hate his guts.
Is it also to do with the fact that George Soros is Jewish?
Who cares? You care about it all the time.
Just ask.
The goddamn Western press all the time. He's Jewish. And who cares? This is a wonderful, wonderful way of attacking the Hungarian government. Because when you say anti-Semitic, then everybody goes, "Ah!" You know, this is...
So you're not an anti-Semite?
No, no.
Hungary is going through identity politics with a vengeance. At this weekly Magyar dance on the grimier outskirts of Budapest, there isn't a tourist in sight. This is all about preserving the fragile and unique soul of Hungary in the face of outside threats, be they from NGOs, migrants or the EU. Here, but not just here. And the question increasingly haunting Europe is this: does putting your country first have to mean putting democracy last? And we asked someone from the Hungarian government to come on the program. No one was available. But with me now to discuss the state of Hungary and what it means for a wider Europe is Andras Lederer from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, a human rights and rule of law watchdog that receives money from the Soros Foundation. Now, he recently found himself on a list of 200 so-called mercenaries of Soros published in the media. Thanks for coming on the program. How did that feel to be in that list? Mercenaries of Soros?
To be honest, in a way, I was very, very proud because extremely brilliant and brave people are on this list. And
What kind of people?
not just other NGO members of staff, but academic people, journalists, very, very famous, well-known, good Hungarian investigative journalists are also on this list. People like Vilki Mlika, who is a globally renowned and respected member of the academia. I never imagined in my life that I would
But
be on a list like
mercenaries of
this.
Soros, I mean, this is militarizing the opposition, isn't it?
It is. Probably I personally started to get used to this. The attacks against the Hungarian Helsinki Committee did not start 2 weeks ago and didn't start a month ago. It's been going on for years. Since at least 2014, when certain NGOs were publicly attacked in the media, and then some of their offices,
Right.
research agencies. This is nothing new for us.
What is Hungary today? Is it still a democracy?
I don't like going into these labeling things.
But that's important, isn't it?
That's very important, but democracy is not black and white.
Yeah. But is it a democracy still? I mean,
I think the question here is whether we can still call it rule of law, for example.
Yeah.
I think that is extremely weakened now. In a country where the key question here is whether the government can exert control on independent civil society organizations and the remaining of the free media, I think this is the real question and not how we actually label it.
And what should Europe do about it?
I think it's very important that the debate has started on what is happening in Hungary and whether this is something that is spreading. We see that many of these issues are actually repeated
in Poland,
in other EU countries.
Czech Republic, some people even pointed Austria. Yeah.
And I think this is a very important fundamental issue also, sort of regardless of what is happening here in Hungary, on the middle run, on the long run, how Europe deals with internal problems. Because it's one thing to have conditions to become member of the club, but what happens when members start to disregard the common values once they are in the club?
And so far Europe hasn't done enough.
I think there is a lot more that could be done. One very positive aspect from the past couple of months was the decision to actually start building a common European fund that would help civil society everywhere in Europe, not just in the East, to tackle with these issues. I think it's also an important issue to think of tying certain support to the respect of rule of law.
Indeed. András Lederer, thank you very much indeed. Well, you heard it there. There's an awful lot to discuss in Brussels, but also, of course, domestically here, but not that many people to discuss it anymore in a free enough way. And by the way, on the 8th of May, the new parliament opens here, and people here expect massive demonstrations on the streets of Budapest. Back to you in London.
The strongman of Europe, Hungary's Viktor Orban and his party Fidesz have won a resounding third-term victory in this month's Hungarian parliamentary elections. The one-time anti-communist and pro-Europe activist who embraced democracy in Europe in 1989 has changed his appeal. He now wants to create an illiberal democracy in Hungary, threatening the very pillars of a democracy, freedom of the press, independence of courts, and harassing the civil groups who challenge his new agenda. His election campaign focused on a single message: the need to stop migration and defend Hungary from outsiders. Alan Little, the BBC's special correspondent who reported on the changes in 1989, has returned to Hungary to look at the inherent dangers both Hungary and the European project now face.
What happened to the democratic promise of 1989, that exhilarating new dawn? That moment when the great civilizations of Central Europe escaped the cold embrace of Soviet communism and came home to the West. On the banks of the Danube, under the bewitching imperial rooftops of Budapest, a new kind of European statehood is being built. It is democratic, but not as we know it, not remotely as Western Europe had hoped for and expected.
There's been, for many years now, an ongoing campaign against independent civil society organizations in Hungary.
A populist leader is someone who says, I represent the people. And then you use that mandate to go after the people's enemies. And the people's enemies may be a free press, the people's enemies may be a university, the people's enemies may be the courts.
If Hungary had had this system that it has now, when it was applying to join the European Union, would it have qualified?
No. No, clearly no.
Hungary's ruling party have rejected the liberal democratic model that has shaped much of Europe since the Second World War. They see themselves as defending Hungary from being bullied by the big powers of Europe and by Brussels into complying with liberal policies that they see as hostile to Hungarian values. They talk of Hungary as though it's facing a real existential threat and the need to defend the Christian heritage upon which Hungarian identity is based. They want democracy in Hungary for sure, just not liberal democracy. Instead, they want what the Prime Minister himself calls illiberal democracy. That has divided Hungarian society along lines familiar to Brexit Britain. In the cities, the young, the educated, the professional middle classes accuse the government of a lurch to the authoritarian right, of taming the judiciary, of bringing the media under government control, of clamping down on any form of organised dissent. They see it as a betrayal of the democratic promise Hungary embraced in 1989. In the summer of that year, months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Hungarians organised what they called a pan-European picnic on the border with Austria. Then, suddenly, unexpectedly, they did something unthinkable for 4 decades. They tore down their section of the Iron Curtain, the first nation to open the gates. The 40-year-old division of Europe was breached. Hungary was open to the West. The emotional impact was huge.
You know, it was for us the fence of our jail.
Laszlo Nagy was one of the activists behind the picnic. He joined Viktor Orban in the fight against communism back then and has remained loyal ever since. You must have known that you were risking a jail sentence by doing this.
Yes, you know, because when I heard this, I was standing there with my car and I received the information and I was thinking, and I knew that there is a law that for being helpful in illegal border crossing, you could get 2 to 5 years jail.
What did that moment mean? Was it about embracing Western-style democracy? Or was it something more visceral, an act of national awakening?
Western Europe, through the high life standard, became a postmodern system. Nation is not so important, identity is not so important, the private freedom is much bigger value than tradition, so on. In our territory, and this is not Hungarian issue, this is an East Central European issue, for us, identity is very important.
National identity.
National identity, and our culture is very important, which we want to preserve.
El akarják venni az országunkat, hogy néhány évtized alatt önként adjuk át másoknak. Más földrészről érkező idegeneknek.
Orban's main appeal is not to democracy, but to the idea of the nation. The campaign was dominated by anti-immigrant sentiment, the fear that Hungary is at risk of being overrun. Orban asked for and won an overwhelming mandate to preserve Hungary, its heritage and culture, for the Hungarians.
In Europe, if we speak about Christianity, we speak not only about the church, we speak about the cultural heritage of Europe, and we would like to represent these values and remain to this cultural heritage.
The campaign turned this man, George Soros, Hungarian-born billionaire and philanthropist, into a national hate figure. For 25 years, Soros has funded organizations that champion liberal democracy. That made him an open critic of Orban's government. The anti-Soros rhetoric was fierce and unrelenting. The implication was unmistakable. Attack Orban, and you are attacking Hungary itself. The Fidesz government has promised a series of new measures to crack down on the activity Soros funds, including the Central European University, or CEU, which Soros founded in Budapest in 1991.
The simple reason the authorities don't like CEU is not that we're an NGO, it's not that we're the opposition, it's not that we're trying to resist the government, it's simply that we're a free institution that doesn't take orders from the government. And we're one of the very few free institutions in the country. This is a government that has substantial control over the media, substantial control over the courts, substantial control over public opinion, substantial control over the economy, and we're not the last person standing, but one of them. And because we're a free institution, we're a problem.
Everywhere now there is a growing fear that speaking out against the Fidesz government carries a cost. The Hungarian Helsinki Committee is a human rights organization that, among other things, helps refugees. It's also foreign funded. It has been publicly denounced by the governing party as hostile to Hungary. It knows it too will be targeted by the government's Stop Soros plans.
We're described as an agent of George Soros. We are said to be complicit in global conspiracy where the European institutions, Brussels, Soros, and civil society activists and groups are wanting to drive millions of migrants, Muslim migrants, to Europe and Hungary with the aim of destroying our cultural and religious legacy and identity.
The migration will be one of the most important issues in the next decades in Europe and all around the world. And therefore we have to have a policy about the migration. And we can respect the other opinion for other countries because it belongs to the national level in the European Union. But we expect that the other countries have to respect also our democratic decision.
It is striking that the most intense anti-migrant sentiment in Europe is in the country that, after the crisis of 2015, has so successfully locked migrants out. Hungary's borders are now so tightly guarded that it's all but impossible to enter the country illegally. Hungary has very few immigrants. It is one of the most ethnically uniform nations in Europe. So how exactly are foreign-funded NGOs helping illegal migration?
In Hungary there are 60,000 NGOs which are operating, existing. And we speak about less than 1% of the NGOs and only 10 or 20 who supports not only the migration but also the illegal migration. And we would like to stop this activity, but we speak only about the illegal migration.
But what are NGOs doing to support that illegal migration?
There are lots, so I wouldn't like to say name of NGOs because I wouldn't like to accuse one or other NGOs, but you can find a lot of articles in Hungary which describe this situation.
But NGOs are still supporting, in your view, illegal migration in Hungary?
Yeah, I think so.
A few days after this month's election, the fiercely pro-government newspaper Figyelő published a list of names of people said to be working against Hungary for the foreign agent George Soros. Marta Pardavi of the Helsinki Committee found her name among them.
The Hungarian government is going after people who have been standing up for democracy, for their views, for their right to freedom of expression, but also can target anybody else they choose to. And I think it sent a very clear message to a lot of people not to speak up, to become intimidated.
You find the same concerns among Hungary's judges. Many are now convinced that the ruling party has created a judiciary that is no longer independent of the government. We spoke to several judges. All expressed concern, but declined to speak publicly. One agreed.
There is a general climate of fear that they can do anything to us judges. In certain types of cases, maybe one involving a foreign currency loan, or refugees, or referring to a politician from any of the parties, the judge may think he or she is expected to rule in a certain way because of the general climate, which suggests he should rule in a certain way. This pressure definitely exists.
Tunde Hando became head of the National Judiciary Office in 2012. Her husband is a founding member of Fidesz and leads the party in the European Parliament. Her appointment is widely perceived to have politicised a previously independent judiciary. So you're saying that the judiciary in Hungary is now largely controlled by a Fidesz party loyalist?
Yes, clearly. And it's very dangerous because all the relevant issues of the administration of the judiciary, for example, appointment of judges, selecting the leaders of the judiciary, the remuneration of judges, are decided by this head of the office.
Viktor Orban's electoral success creates a new reality. Hungary is pulling away from the founding ideals of the European project, turning its back on traditional liberal democracy and offering Europe something else, his own avowedly illiberal model.
My issue with Viktor Orban and CU's issue with Viktor Orban is not whether he has a mandate, but what democracy is. The question will have to be asked, if you have a European member state that doesn't subscribe to core European values, what do? Nobody knows whether Europe will cross that bridge, but if it doesn't, said by somebody who loves Europe, Europe may not survive.
I agree 100% with Viktor Orban that the European Union could work much better if strong nations would be the members. If the reform is not coming, I am telling you, the European Union will fall apart. And that would be a very bad thing, because as I said, European Union, the idea, was the best political idea in the history of Europe, but we are not carrying out this project well.
Viktor Orban has won a third consecutive term. His retreat from the open society values on which the European Union has been built is, for his critics, a retreat from democracy itself. That retreat has been endorsed by the people at the ballot box is the paradox at the heart of European populism.
Alan Little with that report.